Welcome to this Southwark Cathedral podcast, and I'm delighted to say that I am joined by Will Tosh, who is the Director of Education at Shakespeare's Globe. Hello.
Hello, Mark. Thank you for having me.
It's very good to be with you, and particularly in this Pride Week, which is really one of the reasons why I wanted to speak to you at this particular juncture, because your book, which you fairly recently published, now in paperback, Straight Acting: The Many Queer Lives of William Shakespeare. I'm going to ask you in a moment a little bit about the book, but I could just ask you first of all, the many queer lives of William Shakespeare. I know that for many older people, many older gay, lesbian, bisexual people, the word queer is something they wouldn't use in self-identifying because it's a derogatory term in their vocabulary. Can we just define the term here? What are we meaning when we say queer?
That's such a great question. And I was really conscious of the different ways different people, different readers respond to terminology we use today, particularly the word queer, which for lots of people who growing up in their perhaps 50s, 60s, into the 70s, experienced it as a term of abuse, but before the years when it was, in a sense, politically reclaimed by people who are working in gay and lesbian and trans civil rights, and turning it into a term of sort of organization and protest, which then got extended through the 80s and 90s into more kind of scholarly and intellectual spaces, where it became a word to frame and shape inquiries into history and literature that recorded and articulated same-sex or gender non-conformist experience.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, in the sort of intellectual debates of the 80s and 90s, the academics got into a terrible tangle about terms of identity. So there was a period 30 or 40 years ago when historians looking into the histories of gay and lesbian people in the classical world, in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, kind of went for each other over the utility and validity of those terms, gay, lesbian, bisexual, partly because they were understood to be historically situated, to really only relate to life experience from more or less the late 19th century on. It was understood to be sort of historically improper to use those sorts of modern labels to refer to historical people. And one of the consequences of that was a kind of elevation of the word queer, which is just as historically specific and historically situated, but was understood or came to be understood to be more capacious in terms of relating to feelings, forms of identity, perhaps more of a catch-all term for identities based around same-sex desire or gender nonconformity that weren't understood to be as nailed down as gay, bisexual, and lesbian. I mean, I have to say, from the point of view of language, one term perhaps is no more historically accurate than another, but certainly the word queer has come to be really powerful in intellectual and academic spaces, and also in some political spaces as well. But of course it remains a word that has its own history of usage and misusage, and a word that creates completely valid responses in some readers and people who've had certain experiences over the past few decades.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So then in academia, you develop over the last decades what's called queer studies. Do you see yourself as contributing to that with this book?
I think I see myself as benefiting from it.
Oh.
I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to write Straight Acting was, in a sense, my own experience of training as an early modernist, a Shakespearean, who's been really interested in how the 16th and 17th centuries articulated their particular understanding of same-sex desire, queer desire, gay desire, call it what you will. And I used and learnt from really astonishing scholarship from queer studies, queer early modern studies, queer theory, that has really blossomed since the 1980s. I found it incredibly stimulating and useful. But I also found it incredibly complex and sometimes hard to access, and also hard to link always with either the literature of the time or present day experience. But I knew if I put in the hours and tried to understand, I would get there. But I also felt that there was a barrier between contemporary understanding. So I suppose sort of broader kind of general understandings today of a kind of queer Shakespearean history, and the knowledge that actually is there in scholarly books and articles and discussed in conferences and taught at sort of advanced university level to graduate students. I really wanted to find a way to get some of that sort of the queer scholarship, the fruits of queer studies, beyond, I suppose, the constraints of academic writing or academic environments, but into a more general readership book. Because it seemed to me there was a gap in the way experts or students or people with a real passion and a knowledge for the subject thought about the idea of Shakespeare and queer culture, and the questions or the forms of interest that existed beyond the academy. One of the most common questions I've received since working at Shakespeare's Globe or working in slightly more in the public eye about Shakespeare, which is, was Shakespeare gay?
Mm.
And it's such an obvious question. I mean, of course, people are curious and interested, but partly for the reasons we just discussed in our discussion about terminology, and partly for very good archival and historical reasons, it's basically a question that's impossible to answer. But by asking it, we don't ask the perhaps more generative question, which is, what kind of queer artist was Shakespeare?
Mhm.
Whatever his sort of self-defined identity, even if that term is relevant for the time we're talking about, how did Shakespeare articulate his interest in queer human experience as a writer and artist?
Mm. So, I mean, I remember at school, there was a great day in the English department when we had a visit by A.L. Rouse, who I met very briefly, and everybody was in a sort of slight panic about would he be kind or would he be acerbic. And he famously, of course, I think, said that he thought Shakespeare was more than normally heterosexual.
It's an amazing line for many.
And he was gay himself. Um, and I quote that because I think in many ways you might be arguing that this area which you've been exploring, you know, who are these sonnets written to? Why is this cross-dressing, same-sex desire going on in some of the plays and in the poems? This area has somewhat been sort of hidden, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And before I answer that question, it might be helpful for readers just to sort of reel off some of those areas that I look at in the book. And you mentioned the sonnets, and that's an absolutely fundamental part of thinking about Shakespeare's interest in same-sex desire. He writes poems through his life. Those poems, or some of those poems, are collated and published in 1609 in a collection called Shakespeare Sonnets. There's 154 of them. 126 are implied to be addressed by a male speaker to a male youth, and many of them are extremely impassioned. So there's this lingering question of kind of what sort of relationship there was. Shakespeare also, in his plays, depicts same-sex couples who have a sort of level of passion for each other that is equal to straight couples or heterosexual couples in his plays. And I'm thinking of characters like Sebastian and Antonio in Twelfth Night, who are kind of paralleled with the other lovers in that play. Very intimate kinfolk and friends like Rosalind and Celia in As You Like It, or Helena and Hermia in A Midsummer Night's Dream, or Palamon and Arcite in Two Noble Kinsmen, where rhetorics of really intimate same-sex desire are incorporated into the depictions of these characters. So there's this sort of, none of those characters, and certainly the sonnets, have been hidden or unknown over the past 400 years. And at different points in history, they've been acknowledged and discussed in kind of their own terms. But certainly from the 19th century on, there was a sort of concerted effort to make sure that readers and audience members didn't, and I'm doing air quotes here, which is not helpful for your listeners, but didn't misread what they were seeing on the stage in terms of relationships between individuals of the same sex, particularly. The Shakespeare industry, the Shakespeare sort of academic industry, did really want to sort of present a form of Shakespeare that was suitable to a very self-confident, world-leading culture like colonial industrialist Britain that didn't represent this much more complex and much more nuanced picture of human identity and feeling. It was important that Shakespeare wasn't a poet of queer desire, and that was particularly the case with the sonnets, leading to really academically deceitful practices in terms of framing what Shakespeare was doing as a poet with that work, to the extent that numerous critics in the 19th and 20th centuries cited Shakespeare's composition of passionate same-sex sonnets as being a convention, something that lots and lots of late Elizabethan sonneteers did, really nothing to look at, completely ordinary, just a sort of conceit, just a sort of way of showing his poetic skill, really didn't depict any real feeling. Now, that isn't true. Shakespeare is one of only 2 Elizabethan English writers to publish sonnets with a male speaker and a male recipient. And the other one is even more overtly homoerotic. As Richard Barnfield.
Oh, yes.
I will talk about at length if given the opportunity, so you may have to reel me back in on that topic.
But I mean, I can't tell you how many weddings I've officiated at where we've heard, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit a impediment 116, I think, is it? But that's dressed for a man.
Also, why shouldn't a straight couple read that at their wedding? I'm delighted that they want to, but it's also good to know the context of that poem, and good to know for any people out there who are planning same-sex weddings that Shakespeare's sonnets are a wonderful resource if they're looking for poems that delineate that end of love.
I mean, your book, and by the way, if anybody's listening to this and wondering whether they need to be an academic to read it, I don't think you need to at all. I think it is infused with academic knowledge, but it's written in a very accessible and very witty way. Anybody listening to this is going to enjoy it.
I think that was really what I wanted to do with it. Look, I found my studies and research in this field just endlessly and obsessively interesting. And I kind of want to share that. I want to share the what I think I've learned and discovered about that era, particularly in relation to someone like Shakespeare, who means a lot to so many people and certainly to me. And that story, I think the story of not only his sort of life as a queer artist, but his experience of a late Elizabethan, early Jacobean world that is unfamiliar to us in many, many ways, and I think is unfamiliar to us particularly in the way that it found space for and accommodated certain forms of same-sex desire, which is absolutely not me saying that Shakespeare's England was some kind of queer utopia, which it was not, but that the culture, the sort of late Renaissance humanist culture, drew on certain wellsprings of inspiration that included an acknowledgement and a respect, particularly for same-sex male intimacy, which isn't necessarily saying that same-sex sexual contact was always encouraged or allowed, but that expressions of intimacy absolutely were. And Shakespeare is really drawing on that world, as were many other people at the time, and many of his audiences would also acknowledge that sense of acceptance and, in many cases, respect and valorization for modes of expression between individuals of the same sex that really emphasized ardor and intimacy and eroticism.
So you say that he was brought up socially, institutionally, in a queer upbringing, as it were. Let's just look at that a little bit. Let's go to his school. What do we know about his school life and the times that he was growing up in?
One of the things I find so engrossing about thinking about Shakespeare's life and upbringing is the particular era he finds himself born into, like sort of a tail end of the Reformation as kind of in this sort of rebuilding itself. And one way I think in which Shakespeare really experienced that was through his schooling, which takes place in Stratford-upon-Avon in the late 1560s into the 1570s, where we believe he goes to the grammar school, the local grammar school, which is designed really to train sons of middling-class families to be clerics and churchmen and lawyers and notaries and people in professional classes who can kind of do stuff in this kind of post-Reformation world. But the way in which he's taught, where lots of other boys of his age and background are taught, also enables him to be a really great playwright. He's taught to render arguments in writing. He's taught to write a speech as if a particular character is giving it, perhaps a character from history or a famous orator. He's taught to argue things on both sides of the debate. And he's doing it using lots of classical and kind of Neo-Latin sources from around the continent that are drawing on much earlier understandings of human relationships. And there are two texts, I think, that really stand out in Shakespeare's schooling that, for me, kind of define his sort of queer inheritance as a schoolboy. One of them is a work by Cicero, the Roman orator, called De Amicitia, on friendship. And it's this really beautiful treatise about the value of intimate and exclusive, particularly male friendship among educated men. And one of the main points of this treatise is that male friendship, these boys were taught, is the most ardent human experience a man can have, and is the form of kind of relationship that a man should hope for. That's the sort of the kind of relationship you aim for, is to find, if you like, sort of your soulmate who is another man. And now De Amicitia is quite clear about the fact that those relationships are not supposed to be sexual, but the idea of emotional ardor is really kind of baked in to,
There's an intensity to
absolute intensity. And Cicero is both, model for the kind of written Latin that these boys are supposed to produce, but also kind of a philosophical model. For all that he's a pre-Christian pagan philosopher, he is really held up as a sort of training model for the kind of good civically minded man. The other text that clearly occupies a really important part in Shakespeare's mind is another Roman text called Metamorphoses by Ovid. Now, this is probably the most influential piece of creative writing for the European Renaissance. It's a sort of sprawling, great long account of the doings of the Greek and Roman gods and their mortal enemies, friends, victims, whatever. Absolutely massive. Most of the stories revolve around some act of effected transformation. So individuals turned into plants or animals or rocks, usually because one or other of the gods is trying to seduce or rape the mortal concerned. Extraordinary, very troubling set of stories that absolutely sink into Shakespeare in terms of framing the way he thinks about storytelling and magic and character change and bodily transformation. And some of the stories in Metamorphoses are wildly sexually transgressive, both in terms of sexual object choice, if choice is the right word, in terms of bodily experiences of gender transformation, for example. All of these things that Shakespeare's Protestant, late Reformation, really quite oppressive society is also telling him are not allowed. But he has Ovid's Metamorphoses as this kind of storehouse of sexual fantasy, and he has Cicero's De Amicitia, giving him this kind of rigorous sense of pursuit of, as it were, the ideal man, to kind of guide his upbringing and his adolescent school education.
And Ovid particularly coming into play in plays like Midsummer Night's Dream.
Absolutely, which is, you could kind of imagine it as a kind of English folkloric rewrite of, I don't know, the story of Diana and Actaeon, where the human who kind of comes across the immortal in the forest is turned into an animal. I mean, it's
all there. So then the country boy comes to London, and what's he finding here that might be also contributing to his art later?
So one of the things that I set out to ask and then maybe find the answer to is, it's just what Shakespeare knew. How does he get his sexual knowledge? How does anyone in the 16th, 17th century learn about humans and life? Shakespeare may have had his own queer feelings. He may have had his own queer experiences. I think it's probably quite likely he did, but I can't show that archivally. I can't show that historically. What I can show is what was available in London's bookshops to the curious reader that would tell him about other forms of human experience in terms of desire and sexuality. And what I was quite surprised to discover was just the extent to which the Greek and Roman classical inheritance was kind of laid out there on the countertops of London's bookshops. And we're talking about not only the kind of things that Shakespeare would have read as a schoolboy, but slightly more outre texts from writers such as Lucian, who's a kind of Greco-Roman novelist, I guess is the right word of the period, who writes these kind of rather extraordinary short stories about indolent, aristocratic Greek men who sit around on holiday in the Mediterranean talking about the kind of boys they like to sleep with. I mean, it's all completely there. These books were available to buy to an English bookshop browser. The ones that Shakespeare could read were in Latin translation. They weren't in English. But that was fine for Shakespeare. His school training has made him completely fluent in Latin, which is the language of the educated elite, mostly male, although not always, at European classes. And this is material he can access. But that was one of my questions was, if I'm assuming Shakespeare knows about this, because we can see it in his plays, what are his sources? What kind of information is he getting? And it seemed to me that London is a real entrepot for that material. You know, it's a roaring book trade, both of domestic and international titles. If Shakespeare wanted to know about the kind of long classical history, the longue durée history of how previous writers had thought about queer desire, he had it right there for him to look at. We certainly know that he's reading other materials that detail queer relationships from the historical past. And thinking of a writer like Plutarch, again, late antiquity Greek writer who's writing about famous people and heroes from the Greek and Roman past in a series of parallel biographies. And Plutarch, who's translated into English by Thomas North and very well known to Shakespeare, gives detail about, for example, the desire between Socrates and Alcibiades, well-known examples of Greek same-sex desire.
So then the longer poems, so we've talked about the sonnets, but the longer poems particularly you refer to, can you tell us a little bit about those a bit more?
Yes. Yeah, and interesting, isn't it, that one finds that some of Shakespeare's work that is most interesting and most kind of receptive to a kind of queer lens or queer analysis are also the bits of his canon that tend to sit slightly outside the areas of most popularity. So obviously the sonnets, for some people, many people know some of them quite well, but actually as a group, they're not read that much. And Shakespeare's longer poems, Venus and Adonis, Lucrece, Passionate Pilgrim, again, are not that well read. Partly perhaps because some of the ways those poems engage with eroticism and desire are troubling to us, and a poem like Lucrece certainly sits in that category. In a way, I think even Venus and Adonis sits there. It's a poem that I love inordinately, I have to say. I think it's a really extraordinary poem, and many other people do, but it is a bit of a kind of bridesmaid never the bride with Shakespeare's work. It's a form that was quite characteristic of the mid-1590s that later scholars, later critics call the Apilion, a kind of mini-epic, a sort of mini, rather erotic story drawn from classical myth. And Venus and Adonis is Shakespeare's first published work. It's the first thing he publishes under his own name. And it tells the story of the goddess of love, Venus, who tries to seduce the sort of epically beautiful, handsome young huntsman, Adonis, who doesn't really want anything to do with her and fends her off. And in the end, jumps onto his horse and goes off hunting, where he is killed by a boar, gored to death by a boar, and Venus remains unsatisfied and grief-stricken as Adonis dissolves and is replaced by a beautiful flower, drawn, of course, from metamorphoses, active seduction, active transformation. So Shakespeare takes this story, which is quite short in Ovid, and expands it about sevenfold into quite a long poem. I really encourage people to read it because it's amazing, but much longer than the story in his source, into a really extraordinary story of attempted seduction of a man, which is told largely sort of through the eyes, as it were, of the goddess who's trying to sort of perform this act of seduction. which of course sounds completely straight. I mean, it sounds slightly kinky, but straight. But actually what Shakespeare's doing is writing a poem for a really well-established market of erotic verse, which is largely aimed at men. Not wholly, by no means, and in fact the earliest inscribed copy, owned copy of Venus and Adonis that survives is owned by a woman and inscribed by a woman reader. But the core market for this kind of erotic verse were the younger male readers and students at the Inns of Court. So we had law academies just over the river from Bankside in the various Inns of Court and chanceries that were the core of the slightly louche, kind of erotically inclined male reader. So Shakespeare does something really interesting. He's taking a well-known erotic story from Ovid, putting the point of view through the eyes of the seducer, who is the female goddess Venus, and allowing his readers to experience the seduction of the resistant but beautiful boy. So by sort of putting the poem in its context of imagined audience and composition, it kind of unlocks a sort of queer reading of what is ostensibly a, magical, although straight, story of a goddess trying to seduce a young boy.
Fascinating. And then I saw you recently on the documentary Queen James, which is a documentary made out of Gareth Russell's book called Queen James, which is about the desires, really, of the king, James I of England, and the first British king. And what was fascinating to me about that is technically we're dancing around something which was criminal, although not many were ever hauled up formally and for it. But there it was, thanks to Henry VIII in the 1530s. Taking that into account, the sort of criminality of it, how difficult was it to be writing about these things, do you think?
I mean, this is sort of the £64,000 question, isn't it? With writing histories of this sort, is where one draws a line. I don't think actually one does need to draw a line, but where lines appear between feeling, action, particular kinds of action. I've never said the phrase "saving your reverence" before, but I am about to say the word sodomy in the deanery of Southwark Cathedral.
It will fall down.
It will fall. I think I can feel it. I can feel it shaking. But the act you refer to is the Buggery Act of the 1530s, which is instituted in various reigns through the 16th century. The first time that sexual criminality other than rape appears in criminal legislation in England. Before then it hadn't. It had been a sexual misdemeanor, had been a church court matter, and still remains so in many ways in Shakespeare's time. But the criminal law only recognised buggery as an act. Nothing else fell under legislation. So the oppressive legislative framework that maybe we're more used to, which is the late 19th century into the 20th century forms of law that basically criminalized behaving a bit gay. Those late 19th century laws criminalize soliciting, cottaging, looking at someone the wrong way because that could then lead to something. None of those sorts of laws exist in Shakespeare's time. The only thing that's criminalized is one particular sexual act, which has to be witnessed and proved in court. And that's effectively impossible. So it's really not a piece of legislation that really is seen through the courts very often at all. But 6 or 7 cases in the reigns of Elizabeth and James combined from London and the home counties. I mean, it basically just doesn't appear in court. And what that means is we're not thinking about other ways in which intimacy can be expressed or love can be expressed. They're not illegal. They might be frowned on, they might be ethically or morally judged, but actually expressing desire, same-sex desire, passionate same-sex feeling, isn't necessarily interpreted as sodomitical.
No.
You could certainly push it too far and come in for social and disapproval, and other writers did face that. It's possible Shakespeare did. I mentioned the sonnets published in 1609. There is a really sort of resonant silence surrounding those sonnets when they come out. By 1609, Shakespeare is extremely famous. His name has been made not only as a playwright, but as a poet. Venus and Adonis, published in 1593, is an absolute smash hit and turns Shakespeare from a completely anonymous Warwickshire boy working in London to a nationally famous lyric poet. He remains famous, becomes even more famous as a playwright and a kind of leading man of the theatre. It's quite remarkable that in 1609, which is a year that also sees reprintings of Venus and Adonis, barely anyone says a word about the sonnets. And it may be because readers read them and go, oh, actually, no, I'm not sure that is for everyone. Maybe that is only for people who feel the way Shakespeare maybe felt when he was writing them. So yes, that this is, as I said earlier, this is absolutely not a queer utopia. And the ways in which society frowns on same-sex behavior and same-sex desire will be different to the ways of our own society or previous, or more immediately previous societies, but were definitely there.
And you're an early modernist, but I mean, similar themes would be explored, say, in the Georgian period here, wouldn't they?
They would, and I mean, you asked about King James, and in a way, he's sort of, what's the best way to describe it? As a king whose own desires, his own same-sex desires, were really well known, both openly by other senior court figures and senior politicians, implicitly by kind of the general population internationally. That sense that James built his emotional life around powerful male favourites was really well established, and it was, I think, widely understood that they were sexual relationships as well. In some senses, that didn't really hinder James from his kingship. That was just sort of the way he practiced it. But I have a kind of feeling, and this is something that perhaps is less historically established, but it's sort of curious to see this sort of shifts through the next decades. I sort of have a feeling that James's own openness about his desires for beautiful favourites who themselves could become politically corrupted seeded what became a capacity for homophobic judgment. It's only really in the 16 teens and 20s and later that the idea of like using sodomy as a way to attack a male political opponent becomes common. It's not something that you really see in the earlier part of Shakespeare's career, for example. It's something that sort of enters the sort of armory of politics and culture, the tail end and after King James. And by the end of the 17th century into the 18th century, there's much more of a sense that culture, society is using ideas of a certain sort of sexual probity to define class and status and nationality and nationhood and increasingly race as things that one can't be flexible about. So by the time you get to the Georgian period and later, there is much more conflict and abrasion between society and what sort of particularly English society but ought to be, and the reality on the ground when it comes to people's experiences. And that's the era where molly houses, which are extraordinary social spaces for queer men, are raided and closed down, and the idea of the molly becomes a kind of public menace, which is not the case in Shakespeare's life. We know very little about queer social arrangements, other than little fleeting signs of there being potentially a queer sex industry and potentially kind of taverns and things where men and women with queer desires might have kind of found companionship. But we do know that these places were not publicly raided and closed down and people paraded to the streets like they were in the Georgian period.
And I'm guessing Southwark had one or two plays.
I would guarantee it did. I just wish I knew where they were.
So before we draw this to an end, he was married to an older woman. They had 3 children. Where does she fit into this book?
So I think for me, that's another really key reason to keep the focus on Shakespeare as a queer artist, queer writer, a writer who is interested in queer themes. I leave it open about what Shakespeare's own identity was, or sexual identity was. And I also don't think that allowing the possibility of Shakespeare having feelings or interests or desires in one direction removes the possibility that they weren't as ardent and as much a part of his identity in the other direction. And I think for many years, Hathaway, Shakespeare, has received really short shrift from biographers who quite like the idea that she was a sort of unliterary burden from whom Shakespeare had to kind of move away to be the playwright and poet he became. That, I think, has been really blown out of water more recently by, I'm thinking of Tremaine Greer, a really interesting biography of Anne called Shakespeare's Wife, and more recent scholarship covering much more of her life and her experience, and some really fantastic sort of archival discoveries, particularly one recently that shows that Anne spent time in London. There wasn't this kind of, division of Shakespeare's life between family in Stratford and work in London. Anne spent time here too, and was a key part of Shakespeare's business life and kind of financial manager of a lot of the family wealth. I want Anne to be a completely central part of Shakespeare's life, but I don't think that means he didn't also have a kind of creative and emotional interest in queer design.
And you said at the beginning that there's no way at the end of the day we can get to the truth of how he would, in our day, self-identify. And of course, that's another issue, isn't it? It's the translation of 21st century queer terms into an Elizabethan. But
I'm also not interested in putting over evidence and finding proof. No, partly because that language carries with it the air of the courtroom. And I'm like, I don't think it's illegal. I mean, as we've said, there were certain sexual acts that were illegal in Shakespeare's time, but feelings weren't. I think it's okay to take it for granted that Shakespeare had interest in queer feeling and maybe had queer feeling himself. I don't feel I need to be the one to disprove the opposite, if that makes sense.
You sort of hint in the book towards the end that if you had to, you'd conclude probably that he was bi rather than, I think what you say, rather than a gold star gay.
But that a phrase that perhaps I actually shouldn't have used. It's a rather horrible phrase that comes from sort of 1970s and 80s American queer culture, which means a gay man who's never had sex with a woman. So that was rather flippant usage of it in the final pages of the book. But that is clearly not the case. But I think if one is going to put a kind of identity label on him, then I think it's absolutely right and proper to say he's bisexual. He's someone who, in his art, demonstrates real interest in a whole range of human emotional and sexual and erotic experiences, and delineates so many of them so brilliantly.
Let's just finish with our own day. Pride's just about to happen. From time to time, people say, do we still need pride? Come on, And I'm of the mind we probably need it now more than ever. I just wondered where you think queer people stand at the moment in European society. We can think about this country, but Europe generally, because there are many signs, a little bit like you were saying about the Georgian period. The more it's out there, the more vulnerable you are too. For the spotlight to be cast on you, for the finger to be pointed, for the blame to reach you now that you're out in the open. I just wondered your thoughts about our current times.
Well, it's quite hard not to be extremely pessimistic. I mean, I think we've seen examples from the United States, from European countries, of real rollbacks in terms of queer civil rights, both for gay and lesbian people, and bisexual people, and trans people. And that's been quite shocking at the pace. I also think we kid ourselves if we think that legislation targeted at certain queer groups won't, in the fullness of time, be expanded to target people who sit outside the kind of heteronormative model. So I think it's really alarming. We absolutely need pride and other forms of civil rights action more than ever, certainly more in my adult life. There has been really sunlit progress in terms of civic equality, particularly for gay and lesbian people, since the equalization of the age of consent earlier this century. I think we're kind of at the end of the road in terms of the expansion of equality, if that makes sense. And it's absolutely a job to defend those advances that we've made. I do feel quite pessimistic about that future. I think there is optimism to be found in looking back. And I think a real defense against arguments that lodge themselves in ideas of matronous or eternal law, or the fact that men and women have always been X, Y, and Z. And it's quite evident that men and women and everything in between has been any number of things through human history, and cultures and societies find many ways to express queer desire gender nonconformity in ways that are very different to what the modern West deems natural and essential. I think it's really, really important that we look back to histories, whether that's Shakespearean England or historical periods and cultures more geographically distant, and learn as much as we can about how other societies and communities of humans have framed their understanding of how humans feel and love and think, and what that means about their identity. Because we will find many different ways that different societies have done that, and that will help to show that there isn't anything God-given or, forgive me, or sort of fundamentally natural about the way we happen to arrange it in the early 21st century.
Well, I think your book, if I may say so, and I mean, I've really enjoyed listening to you as well today. It's been fascinating and a real joy. Thank you. It seems to me that Shakespeare wanted love to still shine bright, and he knew that that love comes in many shapes and sizes. And you've helped us all, I think, to see just how he did that creatively. We don't know how his imagination was formed or shaped, or what his own emotional inner life was, or his sexual experiences and all that. What we do know is that he was hugely creative in showing us the forms that love can take. And I really want to thank you for your book, which helped me see that very clearly and appreciatively. So happy Pride, and thank you very much for speaking to us today.
Well, Mark, thank you so much. Happy Pride to you.
And those of you who enjoyed this podcast may like to know that you've got to keep your eye out, because Chris Bryant, the MP for the Rhondda, is going to come onto a podcast with me to talk about his book, James and John, which is about the two men who were arrested here in Southwark, who were the last men in this nation to be executed for their love. But for now, Will, thank you so much.